Hello humans, welcome back to these tutorial series. Before we continue our rigging section, we have to talk about constraints and parenting and relationships between objects. So I have this empty scene here and I've created 3 objects, and we're going to explore the possibilities and how we can exactly connect 2 objects together. Now for this to work, we need to open the outliner, which I have marked to Control O, obviously. Notice that we have here in the hierarchy a cylinder, a cube, and a cone. Now, let's say I want to connect 2 objects together, right? Somehow restrict their movement so that I can manipulate one and as a byproduct manipulate the other one. A very simple way to do this is to parent them. So I would select the cube, for example, and I would middle mouse drag over our parent. So let's say it'd be the cylinder. And all of a sudden, the cube is under the cylinder. And notice that it is so in the hierarchy. I can also do this. I can have a child being a parent to another child. So I can daisy chain these together. And you will see that I got 3 stuff parented together. I can keep going further and further down into the hierarchy. Essentially, this is what a joint chain actually looks like. Because if you take a look here, by the way, if you shift click on the plus, it'll open up everything. Otherwise, it'll open up just the last thing. Notice here that I'm opening it up right now with a left click, and I have to left click again here. Whereas if I collapse it, I can expand it with the shift just all together like this, right? So there's that. But one thing to notice here is that essentially once you have a root, anything that is beneath it is going to be affected by this root's transform. So if we take a look over here and we open our channel box, notice that all of these objects, they are separate to each other. Obviously, I kind of screwed it up because this does not look anywhere realistic. But if we reverse this and put this over here and put the cube under the cone, we will have something very close to a hand, an arm. So this would be the shoulder, this would be the elbow, and this would be the wrist. Notice that with the parent option in this way, right? This is where I essentially add them to the hierarchy. I can do so with the scale. Anytime I scale an object, all the children will follow suit. If I rotate the object, all the children will follow suit. If I move the object, all the children follow suit. So anything that I do to this object will be automatically translated to any of these other objects. Anything I do to this object, however, will not be retroactively transferred to the parent. So I can still move this freely around. I can move it like this. I can scale it, right? I can rotate it in a weird fashion. So I still have full control of this object, right? And because it has its own child, I also manipulate the child here. And I can do the exact same with this child. So I can move it up and down, left and right. No, I don't want to say. So as you can see, there are definitely benefits of having something parented to another object, but there's also a lot of limitations to this kind of relationship because it gives you a lot of freedom to the target. Speaking of targets, anytime you want to unparent something, just select it and press Shift P. This will unparent the objects. And here's the most important bit here. If you don't want to just select an object and then drag it onto another one, let's say you forgot how you named it or you didn't name it correctly, got way too many objects in the hierarchy and you didn't group them. What you will always do is select the child first, the parent later with the shift, and just press P. So in this way, this is always the parent. The last thing you select in this situation will be the parent, okay? There's just one thing to remember. Now, let me just unparent these, come on. Unparent. Basically, whenever you want to unparent something, you just Shift P or whatever shortcut you've set up. Obviously, select a child for it, or multiple children, or just all of them and unparent them. But this is very important here to understand that whenever you're parenting something, if you're using the shortcut instead of the outline, make sure that your target, in other words, the parent, is the last thing you select. So if I wanted to parent these two at the same time, so I would select these two and then I'd select this one and I'd press P. Notice that this parents both of these objects to the cylinder. So it's not like in the first case where I had them parented to each other. So if I move this object, it will not move the cube, right? Because they're only parented under this one root. Again, I'm going to Shift P and select and just basically reverse this whole situation. Now, like I said, this is not unlike an arm, right? A joint chain. You've got your elbow, your shoulder, and your wrist. But there's other ways to connect objects together, and we will explore just that right now. Here's the constraint menu. I'm just going to pop it off. Again, it's in the skeleton. It's also part of the animation and keyframing bit. So both of these menus have the constraint drop down. It's the exact same drop down, by the way, so don't get worried. One thing to note about this kind of relationship, actually I probably should just show it to you. Okay, let's go ahead and parent these two together. Now, when we were using parenting, the last thing to select was the parent itself, like the root was the last thing to be selected. In this case, however, it's the opposite. So you want to select what your main root is going to be first, which would be our cylinder, and then select the elbow second. Like in this case, we want to constrain this object to the rules of this object, right? So in this case, we're going to have to do this in reverse. Notice if I parent this now, if I just press P, the cone will be the parent, right? Here's the cylinder, here's the cone. Now, in my case, I don't want to do that. If I press the parent bit here, notice that they still stay separate in the hierarchy, but the cone has an extra object added to it. An extra object. This is not to say that I can't parent these together again. There we go. We've got them parented, but I just removed the constraint here. Or did I? There it is. So the constraint is like a separate object and does not work in the same way as parenting works. Just because it's called parent does not mean that in reality it is a parenting operation. You can think of it as a master-slave operation, okay? In this situation, even though this is called a parent constraint, right? Even though it says parent here, in reality the cone is under an influence, the influence of this cylinder. So let's see how it works. Well, I move the cylinder and lo and behold, so does the cone, right? I rotate the cylinder, lo and behold, so does the cone, okay? However, there's one very important bit here that you have to understand, and that is that if I scale this, the cone will not scale with it. Okay, it'll remain in its own scale. You cannot bind the scale. That's number one. And number two, that's actually the most important bit, is that this object here has absolutely no freedom of movement at all. Everything about it except the scale is being bound to this cylinder. So it is a master and slave relation, not a parent and a child relation. So let's say I try to move this. And you say, well, it still moves around, right? Okay, let me see. No, it doesn't. Anytime you try to go above the permissions of this relation here, parent relation, yeah, you can move it around, but at the end of the day, it won't matter because it will always go what its master has to say to it. And in this case, this is the master. All right, I can still rotate it, right? But the moment I start doing stuff and moving it, like I rotated it now, and I'm just going to move this bit, and things are different again. Obviously, anything else works exactly the same like the parent bit. However, there's one more thing that you have to consider when we're talking about this. Notice that the translate, all of these, by the way, are blue right now, which means that they are parented. Now I'm going to just delete this because for some reason, maybe I'm just an idiot, but I can't get the remove target to work. So as you can see here, I can't get the remove target to work. So this is, let's say the cylinder is my target. I try to remove it. Try to remove the this bit, doesn't work. I select the cone, can't remove it. I select the actual constraint, Just doesn't work. So for some reason, the remove target options does not work, so don't even bother with it. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, so just delete the constraint from the outliner. One thing I wanted to show you here, notice that the coordinates are -5. Let's just say that this has a -5 translator, okay? -5x. Just take a look at the translation here. I'm going to select the cylinder now, and I'm going to parent them together, okay? Now the cone is parented, and look at its translate. It's actually -9, 9.95. Now, why is that? It's because right now the translate, rotate, and all these other channels here are basically relative to the root. Now, for this object, for the cone, the cylinder is the center of the world, okay? The cylinder, this is 0, 0, 0, right here. This is 0, 0, 0 for the cone. And if I do this, I'm going to prove it to you that it happens 0, 0, 0. If I just go and zero this thing out, and the center will be the cone. Now I'm going to go ahead and unparent the cone, and notice at the translate and notice these channels again here. They're different because when things are unparented, the 0 is at the middle of the center of the scene. And here's the most important bit: when you parent two objects together. So I'm going to select the root, and I'm going to select the target. I'm going to parent them. In this situation, I could zero this out just to take a look, because obviously it wouldn't matter. But if I zero this out, still the center of origin, the root for this object is the world, okay? So if I zero this out, I know once I move this, it won't really matter. I just wanted to show you that once you do zero it out, it will essentially go to the center of your world. It doesn't really matter that much, but it's important to understand that it has a separate coordinate system, right? They're not tied together when it comes to coordinate systems. That's not to say that you can't parent them together. Again, you could just parent this cone under the cube. So here's an interesting conundrum. What's going to happen if I rotate the cube? Will it rotate the cone? Well, of course it won't, because the cone has a relative freedom, and the parent bit is only is a master-slave relationship. So anytime I try to do something, I need permission from the master, which is this. Even though these two are parented, I can't do much, right? The only thing I could do is scale. Okay, because remember, the scale is tied together when you have something parented. However, it is not tied together when you have something that is constrained with a parent. So in other words, master-slave relationship. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to Shift P to unparent these schmucks. Come on. And I'm going to go ahead and delete this constraint, because there's something more important here to understand when it comes to constraints. This is your main menu, by the way, when it comes to rigging stuff. Because all of these options basically give you the ability to define a range of motion, okay? So in my case, let's say this is the elbow, and I wanted to define a range of motion that would be realistic for an arm. So if I went ahead, I'm just going to go ahead and just parent these together real quick. Come on. Jesus. There we go. 1 and 2. Let's see if I did this right. Yep. So if I wanted to say, let's say I'm looking for a realistic movement on my arm would only rotate, let's say, all the way down to here. Not further than that, though. This would be the max, okay? Maybe the top would be here, right? You can't go, your arm would not rotate all the way over here, okay? Come on. Like, this wouldn't be real. This would be unreal if your hand could go like this, right? Not to mention that there's also the possibility that not only the rotation, but also the translation of arms is quite improbable if your elbow started moving like that, right? If your elbow suddenly moved. So you'd have to keep this in position, but then the wrist has a lot more freedom. Like, your elbow cannot move in this direction, but your wrist can, right? So all these things, they need to be constrained to each other. I'm just going to unparent these schmucks again. And for that, you need to use these constraints. Now, the parent bit constrains everything, okay? The easiest way to think about this this is your master-slave relationship. It controls everything except the scale, okay? So if I select this and this and I just parent them together, I'm just going to show you the menu here real quick. Here's the thing. When you constrain axes, you constrain the translate and the rotate. Anytime you parent something, you constrain the translate and the rotate, all right? This constraint here, the master-slave, controls the movement and the rotation of the target object. You can maintain the offset, which essentially means that the object is going to stay in place. I'm not too sure what the decompose near object means. Close to original chapter when preserving the initial set. I have no idea what this does. You probably won't have to use this. Obviously, the animation layers, if you have any, you will use this here, but in our case, we don't have any. And set layer to override, that is obviously if you have no layers, it will override the master layer. But it doesn't really matter. These settings, you forget about them. What you need here is the constraint axes. You can select what exactly you want to constrain. Now, let's say you wanted to set the, you didn't want to constrain the rotate, or you wanted to constrain just the rotate. Now, you could do this, and you can rotate, you constrain the rotation of X, Y, or Z, and you can add this constraint here. But in reality, there's two others that do exactly the same thing. So if I click on the point here, notice that this is constraining the axes, which are, by the way, you should maintain the offset of the object here. But if I go ahead and click this, just press add. Now notice here that only the translate is being hooked up together. I'm going to select this cone now, and I'm going to select the cube, and I'm going to do the orient bit as well. So I'm going to go and maintain the offset. Again, always maintain the offset if you want your stuff to remain in place. And I'm gonna say, yeah, all that, yeah, there we go. So we've got the rotation here, and finally I'm gonna select this bit, which is our gonna be our root, our master. I'm gonna select this here, and I'm gonna click on parent. Now, what do we have here? We've got two constraints here, right? Which is, one of them is a point constraint, another one is a parent constraint. Now they're not going to get in each other's way, because if I go ahead and move this, obviously I'm not allowed to do that, so it's all going to go back. Thing is, this is redundant. I have a parent one which does everything, and I have a constraint one, so I can effectively remove the what's its face, the parent constraint, and stick with the rotation constraint. What this means is, if I rotate this object now, nothing's going to happen, okay? Because in this situation, the cone has a point constraint, and the point constraint is a master relationship with movement, okay? Notice on the cone, everything on the translate is blue, meaning that it's being controlled by the master, okay? And only this, by the way, only the translate. The rotation is still free, so I could rotate this myself, right? But because I tied the rotations to my next object, which is the cube, anytime I rotate this, I'm also rotating this other object here. This one does not have control over the rotation, so no matter what I do, the cone is going to stay stationary when it comes to rotation. And in this way, basically, I eliminate the possibility of my shoulder rotation somehow interacting with my wrist rotation, obviously, unless I hook them up together, right? But what's important here is that this gives you the opportunity. Obviously, I could achieve the exact same result if I used the parent options here, but for the cube, I would remove the translate, and for the cone, I'd remove the rotate, right? So this is exactly the same. If we take a look here, there's the point. Ah, crap! I can't stack them together. That's nasty. Look at the point, right? You've got X, Y, and Z. Look at the parent. This is exactly the same as the point. Right now, these settings, okay, this does exactly the same thing as the point of the, and now it does exactly the same thing as the orient, right? So I just want you to know that these things here are available to you in order to actually constrain other stuff. Now, the other two, the pole vector and the aim bit, they're quite interesting. So the aim bit, I'm just going to go ahead and delete a lot of these constraints, well, all of them, because we're going to use the aim bit. Essentially, when you want something to aim towards something else, again, it's the same principle. You select the target that will be aimed at, and then you select the aimer, and you just constrain it. Now, here you've got quite a lot of other stuff, but in reality all you need is to just reset the settings and maintain the offset. Maintain the offset is what's important here, and then you've got the aim vector. I'm just gonna go ahead and click add so that you understand what I'm saying. So every time I move this object now, the cone, let's say this is an arrow, will be pointing towards the object. No matter where I move it, it will always be pointing towards it. So if this was a camera, it would be ideal. Or if this was a gun, or I don't know, if this was a knee or some kind of controller, right? Imagine that this is a kneecap, okay, or a foot. Let's say this is a foot. I'm just gonna rotate this right like that. By the way, because the rotation here is being keyword, even if I rotate this, it won't matter because it's gonna snap back up. So let's just say that this is my kneecap, right? There's my kneecap and this is my leg. There. I mean, this is very rudimentary, but let's say this is my leg, okay? And I need a way, or let's say actually this is the foot, not the kneecap. This is my foot. There. Come on. There, this is my foot, okay? By the way, notice that I can still move it up and down, left and right, and scale it up and down, left and right, because this only connects the rotate. And the aim constraint is basically a master. Any of these, by the way, are master slaves, master and slave. The only difference is which bit exactly are you influencing. But anyway, what I wanted to talk to you about is, let's say that this was a foot and we need to move it left and right. Now, obviously, we could rotate it left and right, but then this wouldn't actually rotate correctly. We'd have to actually go ahead and, you know, grab our pivot here and maybe pivot it at the center, let's say like this, so that the foot rotates correctly. But then you've got other problems, like it's got to move up and down and left and right. And in reality, obviously this is a very stupid way of approaching it, but at the end of the day, let me just go ahead and reset. What was center pivot? I really need to make a shortcut for these, by the way. But anyway, what I wanted to say is, at some point, not for the foot, but for the knee, for example, when you want your foot to shoot outwards, this is very nice because it's going to move all of your foot. Like if you have to rotate your hip. Like imagine if there was a hip right here and you had to rotate your foot. It's kind of hard to explain, but if this is you standing and you want it to point this way, your whole leg, you'd need to rotate your hip. And in order to rotate your hip, you needed something, and at least in Maya, you need something to influence just the hip. Now, obviously, it's possible to use the pole vector here, and the pole vector is what I've already showed you, the ability to essentially control where the thing pivots across. It's like you've seen the handles anyway, the IK handles. It's at the top usually, and it shows you which way is forward so that it bends according to that plane. So if I were to bend, let's say this was a knee and the pole vector was pointing that way, the knee would bend that way. If it pointed backwards, the knee would bend backwards, and that's not what you want. All right. So we're not going to go over pole vector because I really am not going to be bothered here creating IK handles. And these pole vectors in general, I've never had to use this particular constraint, all right? But then again, you might use it for something else, I don't know. By the way, notice that it's also possible to constrain this particular rotation. So let's say I select this object here, and I'm gonna open the attribute editor, and I'm gonna go into the aim constraint, and you've got all these same attributes here, but I believe you could, let me see, limit information, and you could limit the rotation of this aim constraint, okay? So you could say that the maximum minimum rotation here would be, oh, I don't know, 20 and 20 degrees. So that would be quite handy. Obviously, it's redundant to do this now, but in reality, you probably do this for your animator. You may actually have to do this on the cone shape, I believe, or just the regular cone. I'm not too sure if you have to do it on the cone. No, as you can see here, this is actually limited already. But let's go ahead and limit this and see what happens. So the minimum and maximum would be, yeah, let's say this is the min and max. Yeah, I believe you wouldn't have to do this on the constraint because the constraint has its own, what's its face? it has its own pivot, so it wouldn't really matter for the constraint. You'd have to select the actual object, because notice I can still rotate this whichever way I like, right? I can still move it left and right, up and down. But if I constrain the object itself, then things are a little bit different. Well, this is the cube, so I need to select this bit. There we go. So I'm going to select the X, and 45 degrees is all you get. So at the end of the day, this is all the movement you'll be getting. It's bugging out for some reason. Yeah, I'm not too sure what exactly went wrong here, but it doesn't really matter in this situation because we're not going to be doing humanoids, and you probably figure this out on your own once once this happens for you. Because maybe you just have to rotate limit all the other ones because they're probably rotating across it. So if we limit all these, probably it's all going to be 45-degree angle here. God damn it! I'm on the cube again. Not this bit here. Let's see. Now this should be workable. Yeah, 45 degrees is all you're getting in any of these axes. But then again, this is also an aim constraint, so you probably wouldn't use the aim constraint in that particular sense. With the rotation limits here, you'd probably put it on a controller and have the controller have a limit in actual movement range. So you wouldn't constrain the let me just zero out these fucking rotations here on this cube. Yeah. So in reality, you would have, for example, this constraint being this is as much as it's going to move, okay? Let's say something like that. You wouldn't constrain the actual object. But it is certainly possible. You could do that. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say, guys. Just remember that relationships between objects can get quite complicated once you have a very heavy hierarchy here. Let's say you've got 200 bones, well, not 200 bones, but let's say you got something like 100 bones or even 50 bones, 50 joints. That's a huge hierarchy, right? You're gonna have to like open this whole thing up and hunt down for different bones. By the way, that's when you want to be naming your bones appropriately so that you don't lose them. You can easily find them. But these constraints will really work wonders when you start rigging stuff together so that you don't screw something up. Obviously, there's other things like driven keys, which are also type of constraints, I'd say. This bit here, set driven key. This is essentially like, look, we're going to talk about keyframes once we're done with rigging, all right? But this is our last volley into the toolkit. We're not going to go about lighting and shading or texture baking because this stuff, we're going to do this in another piece of software. But obviously you could play around with it like with the 3D baking tool or whatever. That's obviously assuming you want to go through the UVs, which is a whole nother story entirely, right? We're not going to go into UVs just yet. We better have our models done and animated first, and then we're going to go into UVs and painting them with textures and all that. Anyway, I'll see you guys next time. Play around with these constraints. Just find out what works and what doesn't, all right? I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.